Hi there, Michael Backus, and today we're going to just kind of walk through a lot about what we currently know about how cannabis works. This is a moving topic. What we think we know about cannabis today is going to be different next year and the year after, but I'm going to give you a kind of a snapshot of where we are today, and maybe I'll be back to update this class in a couple of years. We're going to start with the endocannabinoid system. Most of us have heard of the endocannabinoid system. It's a signaling system throughout the body. I like to think of it kind of like a seesaw, a teeter-totter. It's a homeostatic regulatory system. And what that means is it basically functions kind of like a thermostat for a lot of physiological processes within the body. So the endocannabinoid system consists of four primary classes of components. Okay? The first are the endocannabinoid receptors themselves. The endocannabinoid system was discovered in the late 80s, early 90s by a group of scientists around Dr. Raphael Mechoulam, a Bulgarian-Israeli scientist working at Hebrew University. And what Professor Mechoulam and his postdocs discovered was first they started to see some evidence of receptors within the body, the CB1 and CB2 receptors, and also their associated ligands. These are the actual molecules that interact with these receptors. And these are the endocannabinoids themselves, anandamide and 2-AG. And the thing is that the endocannabinoid system consists of the receptors, the endocannabinoids themselves, like anandamide and 2-AG, the biochemical machinery that synthesizes and degrades these fats or lipids. And the thing that's fascinating about the endocannabinoid system is that it's involved in basically every single aspect of mammalian physiology and pathology. In other words, how the body works, but also how the body works in disease states. And the endocannabinoid system may actually extend to as far as our individual personalities. Raphael Mechoulam has posited that a lot of the individual characteristics of our personality may be a reflection of how our individual endocannabinoid systems are currently working. And that's really fascinating because when we think of the endocannabinoid system and things outside of the endocannabinoid system like cannabis, we have a tendency to kind of stop at cannabis. But there are a lot of things that interact with the endocannabinoid system well beyond cannabis. For example, it used to be that they thought that a runner's high was caused by the release of endorphins, our body's own opioids. But in fact, a runner's high is directly related to release of endocannabinoids in the body and how those endocannabinoids are broken down. So the kind of runner's high afterwards is very similar to some degree to a cannabis psychoactivity. And so but things like yoga, exercise, acupuncture, probiotics, all of these things interact with our endocannabinoid system and how that system basically works. And so today we're going to kind of take a little walk through the endocannabinoid system and how cannabis interacts with it so you have a better idea of how cannabis actually functions. So the interesting thing when we think about the endocannabinoid system is we typically think about the brain. And we think about the brain because there are so many endocannabinoid receptors expressed throughout the brain. In the frontal lobes and cerebral cortex, where a lot of thought takes place, but also in the regulatory parts of the brain like the limbic system, parts of the brain like the amygdala that basically modulate emotion and are responsible for aspects of anxiety and fear response. And the amygdala is really interesting because it's also involved in a particular type of memory, memories that are crude but very, very quickly retrieved, like the shape of a snake moving. And the reason this is important is later I'm going to talk a little bit about how cannabis interacts with various networks of these components throughout the brain and how our increased understanding of cannabis's interaction with those components explains some of the adverse effects that some people have when they take cannabis. Other parts of the brain that are impacted by the structures such as the hippocampus. Cannabis interacts with the hippocampus, and what happens there is that the hippocampus is responsible for memory and learning. And when cannabis interacts with it, certain cannabinoids such as THC can have a negative impact, and you end up with the where did I put my keys phenomena that's associated with cannabis. But also certain cannabinoids such as CBD have a protective effect over hippocampal function. And in fact, some of the long-term changes observed in the brains of people who only use THC go away if that person uses THC and CBD at the same time. The big question over the last couple of years has been, what is the mechanism of action of THC? How does it really work within the body? Is it working exactly like an endocannabinoid, or is it working similarly? So I had John Carapello, who's a real famous medical illustrator, do an illustration for my company that basically shows the mechanism of action of the endocannabinoid system at the synapse. The synapse is the gap between two neurons, and it's part of the kind of the railroad of your nervous system, especially within the brain. And so what endocannabinoids do is they are a retrograde messenger. And what that means is that they send the message back up the tracks of the railroad to tell the nerve cells what neurotransmitters to release. And they regulate that process. And what THC does in cannabis is it mimics one of those endocannabinoids and interacts with the CB1 receptor at the presynaptic neuron and modifies how neurotransmitters are released from that presynaptic neuron. And that's really important because not only can we have an understanding of how THC works, but we can also design molecules, and we can use other molecules in combination with THC to modify the effects of THC at that particular receptor. And that's really important because everything you see on the screen in this illustration of the mechanism of action at the synapse is involved in the basic levels of the endocannabinoid system. At the postsynaptic neuron, you have these chemicals that are synthesized with enzymes into the endocannabinoids themselves. Then you have transporters that ferry these molecules across the synaptic gap to the presynaptic neuron, where it interacts with the CB1 receptor, and then signals go out from the CB1 receptor into the neuron itself. And now we're learning that we used to think that the endocannabinoid receptors were primarily on the outside of the cells, but now we're learning that the endocannabinoid receptors are also on the inside of the cells. And that's really important because their expression within the mitochondria inside a cell means that the endocannabinoid system helps monitor and regulate energy balance within a cell. And that's really important for a lot of things, whether it's potentially cancer, aging, metabolic diseases. A lot of these things can be impacted by mitochondrial function in the endocannabinoid system. So stay tuned to that because that's cutting edge stuff, and we're going to see that develop over the next couple of years. The other thing where we see endocannabinoids expressed are in cases of inflammation or tissue injury, and that's primarily immune modulated, which means that the CB2 receptor, which is primarily expressed within the immune system, shows up. And so when you have things that interact with the CB2 receptor, which is not so much phytocannabinoids, except for one phytocannabinoid that doesn't get talked about much, and that is beta-caryophyllene. When we hear of beta-caryophyllene, typically we think, oh, cannabis terpene, or in this case, sesquiterpene. But what's really going on is that beta-caryophyllene works as a cannabinoid. Now, what's fascinating about that is technically, under some interpretations of U.S. drug laws, there's a chance that beta-caryophyllene should be considered a Schedule I substance. And what's fascinating about that is, since it's found in black pepper and cloves and a lot of other foods, and it's recognized, generally recognized as safe by the FDA, That means technically every diner in the United States has a shaker full of a Schedule I substance sitting right on the table. And what's really great, though, is that beta-caryophyllene is a really, really potent immunomodulatory CB2 agonist, which means that it interacts with this receptor and it can help modulate some inflammatory conditions and some conditions that are effectively associated with injury. Now, take a step back for a second. Take a step back to the endocannabinoids. An interesting thing about anandamide, which is one of the principal endocannabinoids, is it's considered the stress endocannabinoid, which means it's expressed when the body is stressed. Now, that stress can be injury, it could be a neurodegenerative disease, such as Alzheimer's. So our understanding of how anandamide works in the body is going to be increasingly much more important. And the reason it's going to be so important is that a lot of people are concerned with metabolic diseases such as diabetes, schizophrenia, some of these neurodegenerative conditions like multiple sclerosis and Huntington's, chorea, and all of these different diseases and disorders. And it looks like the ability to either enhance the function of anandamide, slow down how fast the body breaks it down, figure out ways to increase the amounts of it in tissues or decrease the amounts of it in tissues, can be very, very important in treatment of diseases that are involved with the endocannabinoid system. So if you look out there today and you look at, well, what can we do with cannabis? What can we do with endocannabinoid-based medicine? What conditions are officially approved? It's a really, really short list. And the reason it's a short list is that the FDA has been very, very tight in their approval of cannabinoid-based medicines. Currently, it's only approved for nausea and vomiting, anorexia and cachexia, and multiple sclerosis. In the near future, I think that that's going to be broadened considerably because there are probably 50 different diseases out there that all fall under this idea of metabolic dysregulation, and because the endocannabinoid system regulates metabolism throughout the body, interfering with that dysregulation and repairing or restoring endocannabinoid tone through phytocannabinoid and endocannabinoid interventions are going to have impacts on everything from brain trauma to cancer. Now, today you'll hear a lot of overstatement about the use of cannabis with cancer. There is absolutely no question that cannabis and cannabinoids have a place in cancer treatment, but you have to be really, really careful to know which cancer you're treating with which cannabinoid, because in some cases certain cancer cells respond by proliferating when they're exposed to certain cannabinoids, and in other cases that cancer cells can be killed through processes like apoptosis. And so the important thing is that don't believe the hype that cannabis kills all cancers. It's simply not true. Cannabis most likely kills certain kinds of cancer cells, and definitely in cell studies and in animals. And as scientists often say, science has been curing cancer in animals for decades. It's just not as good at curing it in humans yet. So we have to take a lot of these claims with a grain of salt and really interact with physicians and get the latest research information so that the right decisions are made if cannabis is going to be used in cancer therapy. We're going to look at the phytocannabinoids now, and those primarily consist of 4 classes of cannabinoids. Now, the thing about this is that you'll often hear, oh, there are 120 different cannabinoids that we've been discovered so far. Well, that's not very practical information. And the reason is there are 4 basic classes of cannabinoids, and then there are an enormous amount of variations and breakdown products from those 4 classes. But the plant produces THCA, CBDA, CBGA, and CBCA. Those are the acidic versions of the cannabinoids as produced by the cannabis plant. As many of you know, THCA is not psychoactive. It has to be heated, give off a carboxyl group, and convert itself from its acidic to neutral form, THC, and then it becomes psychoactive. almost all the cannabinoids exhibit different actions when they're in their neutral versus their acidic state. And what's fascinating about that is that there are theories now that for a long time THCA was discounted as a medicinal form of THC because people thought it wasn't bioactive. But there's an interesting hypothesis that's been floated out there right now that it may actually work when the cells are dysregulated, that they're not working. So for a healthy person, if they take THCA, they feel nothing. They get no real bioactivity. But if the person is in a disease state or disordered or dysregulated in some way, THCA may actually work only when that dysregulation is in place. That's kind of interesting. CBD we've all heard of. It's a non-psychoactive cannabinoid. It's associated with interactions with dozens of receptor systems throughout the body. Now that's the good news and the bad news about CBD. The good news is it interacts with an enormous amount of receptors throughout the body. That typically indicates very, very low toxicity. But one of the things that CBD interacts with is the enzyme systems that help your body process drugs, metabolize drugs in the liver. And if a person is taking something like a blood thinner that's broken down by the same enzyme system that CBD interacts with, it actually can prevent the body from breaking down the blood thinner, and levels of it within the body will start to elevate, and it could be dangerous. So the thing about it is that you'll often hear from people that, oh, CBD, it doesn't have any side effects. Well, it's actually not true. It actually exhibits some significant drug interactions, and you just have to be informed, and doctors have to be informed about how these cannabinoids interact with different systems throughout the body to make sure that there's no interactions or side effects that could be of concern. CBGA. CBG is the precursor for THC and CBD. What that means basically is that's what the plant uses in combination with an enzyme to make THC or CBD. Now what's fascinating about CBG is it also comes in a variant form, CBGV, and when that shows up and interacts with an enzyme, what will happen is you'll get a conversion into THCV or CBDV, and these variant forms are of great interest medicinally right now. They're very, very rare in the cannabis marketplace in the United States, but that's going to change. You'll start to see the first THCV strains hit the market more widely in 2017 with CBDV right behind it. And then CBC. CBC is the cannabinoid we never see. And for years we didn't really know why we didn't see it. We knew it was out there. But it turns out that CBC is only produced by juvenile cannabis plants, which means that right after they go into flowering, about 2 weeks in, if they're going to produce CBC, they'll produce it then. And so for years, when we were looking for CBC, we were looking for it at the wrong time in the plant's flowering cycle. We were looking for it after normal, 10-week harvest, and it was long gone. What's fascinating now is that people are starting to look at plants in the lab 2 weeks in the flowering to identify which varieties are going to produce the most CBC. And stay tuned. There's not a lot of knowledge out there right now about which strains are the ones that actually have a tendency or proclivity for producing CBC. Then the last major phytocannabinoid, as far as I'm concerned, is beta-caryophyllene. Beta-caryophyllene, as I said, is produced by cloves, it's black pepper, very common sesquiterpene produced in cannabis, associated with strains like cookies or the old Colombian and Panama Red strains from back in the day. They all share kind of a slight peppery smell, a little bit of a clove note, and it's a fantastic medicine. It's fantastic in combination with both CBD and THC. And so it's really heartening to me that in the kind of medical/recreational markets right now, or adult use markets, what we're seeing is cookies become one of the most popular strains in the last few years. And the reason is it just has a lot of broad-ranging effect, plus it's low in myrcene, the terpene that's responsible for sedation and crashing. And so when you use cookies, typically you don't get that crash at the end like you can with a lot of strains that have a lot of myrcene. What's fascinating is that we're starting to learn from back in the day. We're starting to see why certain varieties like Panama Red or Colombian were interesting to people because they were high in particular terpenes of great interest to cannabis users. There's a lot of myths out there, though, about the past of cannabis. Like, for example, that cannabis smoking goes back, tens of thousands of years, et cetera, et cetera. It's complete nonsense. Most smoking of cannabis actually doesn't take place until after Columbus comes back from his first trip to North America. And the reason is that when he was here, his crew members interacted with an indigenous group of people called the Taino down in Cuba, and they smoked tobacco. And Columbus's crew, part of them, got hooked on smoking tobacco and took it back to Europe. And because it's so addicting and fun for a lot of people, and it was long before they knew the terrible health impact of smoking tobacco. So it became hugely popular across Europe, spread through North Africa, it spread around the world. And one day somebody was looking obviously at cannabis and go, I wonder if I could smoke that. And that's really when cannabis smoking became popular. It's back to Columbus's crew members and an early drug addiction problem that led effectively to us using cannabis as an inhaled smoked substance today. The other thing that's interesting about cannabis is that there's this whole conversation going on around indica and sativa, and it can be very, very confusing, especially to plant scientists. Plant scientists aren't really focusing on the psychoactive effects. They're just trying to figure out what species are in play here when we're talking about cannabis. And the big discussion right now is primarily around indica and sativa. And a group of plant scientists currently believe that sativas are actually not drug cannabis. They're not used for their psychoactivity, that they are used primarily for fiber. They're primarily found in northern Europe and northern latitudes across Russia all the way to China and East Asia. And that the southern varieties, south of the Himalaya and across the world, are the drug varieties that primarily produce THC. And so the basic distinction right now is that sativas produce CBD, indicas produce THC. Now, what's responsible for the indica effect, that broad leafleted strain that gives me the couchlock effect? Well, it turns out the shape of the leaf really doesn't have much to do with the effect that's being delivered by the plant. The effect that's being delivered by the plant has to do with its cannabinoid content and its terpene content and how the terpenes and cannabinoids interact. So the current thinking is that myrcene may cause the more indica-like effect, and that the more sativa-type effect primarily has to do with less myrcene and also with some of the stimulating terpenes like pinene. Beta-caryophyllene can be mildly stimulating, still gets you pretty high, so it definitely is associated with psychoactivity. And then things like limonene can reduce anxiety a little bit, are considered mildly antidepressant, et cetera, et cetera. So for a second, I want to talk about adverse effects because, again, it's one of these things where the common knowledge, which is completely wrong, is that, cannabis is a plant, it's from nature, it couldn't do anything bad to you, and that's kind of nonsense. The reality is, cannabis contains some pretty strong drugs. CBD is a strong drug. THC is definitely a strong drug. And we have to respect them. We have to be scared of them. We just have to understand them. So I'm going to run through what are considered some of the kind of side effects of THC-predominant cannabis, as brought to you by our good friends at the National Institute of Drug Abuse, NIDA. And so they talk about acute effects such as short-term memory impairment, impairment of judgment, anxiety, paranoia, and then persistent effects that learning is impaired over time, that sleep may be impaired over time, and then long-term effects that there's addiction risk, bronchitis, schizophrenia, anxiety, depression, and loss of motivation. Now, all of these things together are kind of the package that are associated primarily with one ingredient in cannabis, and that is THC. Now what's fascinating is entourage compounds, other compounds produced by the plant, can mitigate the side effects associated with THC alone. And that's incredibly important because a lot of extractions and concentrates today and a lot of cannabis varieties out there today may have terpenes in them but often don't have any CBD at all. And what's really fascinating is it's the presence of CBD and a few of these terpenes that can reduce or eliminate a lot of these side effects. And so it's incredibly important to learn how to construct an entourage for your own or your patient's cannabis use that eliminates or reduces these side effects. And the fastest way is to make certain that there is a CBD buffer present in every THC preparation that a patient or user takes. And if you do that, it's been shown by recent brain scanning research in the UK, the United States, and Australia. The most recent study was published in Australia in February, that a CBD buffer actually prevents changes noticed in the brain of long-term heavy chronic THC users alone. And how did they find that out? Super simple. They just took a hair sample of the people who were part of the study. If their hair contained only THC, they had the brain changes in the brain scanning study. They showed up every time. If they had CBD and THC together, their brains were indistinguishable from the brains of someone who had never used cannabis at all. That's extremely important. Now, another thing that's important is on this list, entourage compounds can get rid of every single adverse effect except for bronchitis. And the reason that bronchitis hangs out is people have a tendency to hold their breath when they smoke cannabis. It's a really dumb idea. And the reason is the THC content in cannabis today is so high that you don't have to hold your breath like you did back in the day when it was only 2% THC. When it's 20% THC, you can inhale it and you can exhale it. And the good news is you'll keep irritants in your lungs for less time and you'll be less likely to develop a cough from it. And then also another thing, CBD, a little bit, added to any smoked THC, also is a great antioxidant, and it may actually help protect your lung tissue as well. So that's kind of a view of the entourage. The entourage is really important, and I'm not going to get into it today because I know there are other classes here at Green Flower that really deal with terpenes. But the thing is that understanding the construction of your entourage is extremely important. You want to protect memory, make sure there's pinene. You want a mood elevation effect, make sure there's limonene. You want to go to sleep, make sure there's myrcene. It's really, really clear and simple, and we're learning more about it all the time. Companies around the United States in adult use legal states are really looking at these compounds and what they do to figure out how to build better entourages. Now, up on the screen in a minute, you're going to see this really interesting, these are from fMRI brain scans that were done by a guy named Matt Wall as part of a study at University College London. And recently, just in the last 6 years, brain scanning scientists have started to figure out that there are networks within the brain that do specific things. They're called resting state networks, and they do really interesting things. One of the networks does executive control, which basically is kind of about volition. I'm going to do this, all right? Another one is the default mode network, which basically it's where the brain is thinking about the past or the future or what I had for lunch or da-da-da-da-da. It's where you basically spend most of your time. That's why they call it the default mode. And then there's a network called the salience network. And the salience network figures out what's salient or important from all the stimuli that's coming into your brain. And what's fascinating is they compared THC and these networks and THC and CBD together and these networks. And they found out something really interesting. THC is constantly associated with anxiety and paranoid effects from people who take too much of it or are inexperienced with it. They found that THC interferes with all three of those networks in the brain, changes their function slightly. But THC and CBD together, well, they affect two of those, but they don't affect the salience network. And what's fascinating about that is The salience network figures out what's important. And when you can't figure out what's important, you get paranoid and anxious. And so if you use THC and CBD together, you may be able to avoid patients or yourself getting anxious or paranoid and from THC, which is just an incredible kind of scientific result, and we just learned it in the last year. So the one message I'm going to take and try to impart to you today, okay, and it's the most important message, is the one thing we do not understand about cannabis is how to dose it intelligently. I'll give you an example. I gave a lecture to a bunch of oncologists a few days ago in Sacramento. And all we're talking about is cannabis dose, cannabis dose, cannabis dose, cannabis dose, starting at 2.5 milligrams of THC, which is the level at which most people begin to feel psychoactivity. And what's fascinating is that that's a really useful dose. It means that you can give it to a person and they'll have the effects of THC, but they won't get particularly high from it. I stress minimum effective dose. You want to use the least amount possible to get the effect you're looking for. The thing that's really important about cannabis is because it's relatively non-toxic, people take way too much. So I talk to these oncologists. I go to a friend's dispensary in Sacramento. The friend is actually meeting with a patient from the hospital group that I just talked to. And the bud tender behind the counter is looking at this cancer patient who's never used cannabis before and recommending they start with a 10 milligram dose of THC. That would make the average elderly non-cannabis user extremely anxious, all right? And so this idea that the person behind the counter is recommending a dose with which they're comfortable rather than what the person with whom they're speaking is comfortable, that's an important consideration. The idea is that the reason that phytocannabinoids work is they interfere with the teeter-totter of the endocannabinoid system. And just like a teeter-totter, you don't want to jump on one end because somebody's going to lose some teeth on the other end. And this idea becomes that all you're ever trying to do when you use cannabinoids is establish balance or restore endocannabinoid tone. It's a homeostatic regulatory system. It is all about balancing your dose. If you're out there dabbing, what's going to happen is if you're dabbing without CBD or just dabbing too much of everything, what's going to happen is you're going to get receptor downregulation. And your body's going to react by reducing the density of CB1 receptors throughout your brain. Absolutely nobody knows what the long-term effects are. But we do know it's the thermostat for a lot of regulation within your brain and nervous system. And long-term downregulation and reduction of density of CB1 receptors may have some long-term effects that we simply don't understand today. The idea and the message I'm trying to get across to you is control your dose. Control it intelligently, modulate that dose with entourage compounds, and you're going to have a much, much better outcome. Thanks a lot.